I should have sensed something was off the moment I opened my eyes that morning. There was a strange silence outside, a quiet so unnatural it made me uneasy. Usually, the neighborhood had a gentle hum, birds chirping, the distant hum of lawnmowers, kids on their bikes. But today, nothing, just an eerie stillness. When I stepped out onto my porch, coffee in hand, the first thing I noticed was a bright yellow tow truck parked right in my driveway. Parked, as if it belonged there. Next to it stood two men in matching pale blue polo shirts and khaki pants. The kind of outfit you'd expect from mall security or overeager HOA volunteers playing cops for the day. They even had badges clipped to their belts, though I could tell they were cheap plastic ones you could buy in bulk from any office supply store. At first, I thought they had the wrong house. Maybe they were here for someone else's car. But then I saw them fiddling with a winch, getting ready to hook it onto my car, my pristine, fully registered, legally parked car, sitting exactly where it had been since I moved into this house 5 years ago. It was parked in my driveway, my property, completely legal. And yet, here they were, acting like they were part of some elite law enforcement agency about to bust a major criminal. One of them had a notepad and was scribbling furiously, looking like he thought he was drafting the next great police report. The other was muttering into a walkie-talkie, nodding as if he was coordinating a major sting operation. It would have been hilarious if it weren't so absurd. This wasn't an inspection. This wasn't regulation enforcement. This was an attempted theft, dressed up to look like official business. I said nothing at first. I want to see how far these two clowns, let's call them Tim and Roy, were willing to go before they realized just how badly they were screwing up. Part of me was curious, but another part of me wanted to give them enough rope to hang themselves. I crossed my arms and leaned against the porch post, watching them. It wasn't until Roy actually started attaching the tow hooks to my front axle that I decided to speak up. "Morning," I said casually, like I wasn't watching two wannabe sheriffs try to steal my car. Tim, the one with the notepad, jumped like he hadn't seen me there. But he recovered quickly, straightening up and puffing out his chest. "This is an official action sanctioned by the Oak Ridge HOA," he said in a tone that made me think he'd practiced it in front of the mirror. "Your vehicle is in violation of community parking regulations." I couldn't help but smirk. "Oh yeah? And what violation would that be, officer?" Roy, still fiddling with the hook, muttered something under his breath, but Tim pressed on. He flipped his notepad around and jabbed a finger at a sheet of paper printed in size 6 font, full of legalese. Section 12, paragraph 8, line 4. No private vehicle may remain parked in a visible residential area for more than 48 consecutive hours without significant relocation. I blinked. "You're towing my car because it's been parked in my driveway for 2 days?" Tim nodded solemnly, like he was quoting from the Constitution itself. "That's the rules, sir." That's when I realized these guys had no idea who they were dealing with. They didn't recognize me. They didn't know they were trying to impound the vehicle belonging to Colton Raines, the city's chief of police. And that made this even funnier. I decided to play along. "And what's the fine for this heinous offense?" I asked, fighting the grin that tugged at my lips. Roy, who'd finally stopped pretending to talk into the walkie-talkie, chimed in. $150, he said proudly. I laughed. "So, let me get this straight. You're about to tow an $85,000 car over a $150 fine." For a second, Tim hesitated, as if some distant part of his brain was finally processing how ridiculous that sounded. But then he squared his shoulders. "The rules must be enforced." "Of course," I said. "The sacred rules." By now, a few neighbors had wandered out to see what was going on. Mrs. Feldman, from 2 houses down, stood by her mailbox with her phone raised, recording. Mr. and Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly couple who walked their schnauzer every morning, whispered to each other behind cupped hands. Even the dog, Max, sat on the sidewalk, watching like he knew someone was about to get seriously embarrassed. And yet, Tim and Roy kept going. They started the tow truck engine. They were really going to do it. I sighed, pulled out my phone, and dialed. "Sergeant Diaz," came the familiar voice on the other end. "Diaz, I need a patrol car at my house," I said. "I believe my vehicle is being stolen." There was a pause, then his tone shifted. On our way, Chief. I hung up and looked back at the two stooges. Gentlemen, I said, before this gets any messier, you should know something. I am Colten Rains, Chief of Police, and in about 3 minutes, an official police unit will be here. We'll see who's breaking the law then. Their faces went pale. Gone was the bravado. In its place was sheer panic. Tim's notepad slipped from his fingers. Roy's hand fell from the hook. They exchanged frantic glances, whispering in hushed voices. Tim made a quick throat-slash gesture to the tow truck driver, who cut the engine. But Roy, bless his heart, wasn't quite ready to give up. We can't let him intimidate the HOA, he said, puffing out his chest like he was about to lead the charge of the Light Brigade. I stared at him for a second. Are you serious right now? I asked. The neighbors weren't even trying to hide their laughter anymore. I saw at least 3 phones filming. This was going to be the HOA's greatest hit, probably viral by nightfall. Then we heard it, the siren. A cruiser pulled up in front of my house. Officers Diaz and Monroe stepped out like they were arriving at a picnic, casual and calm because they already knew the score. Monroe gave me a nod. I nodded back. Diaz approached the 2 men, resting a hand on his duty belt. Can someone explain why there's a tow truck attempting to remove the chief of police's private vehicle from his own driveway? Tim started stammering, flipping through his notepad like he was searching for a magic clause to justify his stupidity. Roy froze completely. I'm waiting, Diaz prompted. Tim cleared his throat. Under HOA regulations. Diaz held up a hand. Are you officers of the law? Silence. Do you have a court order for vehicle removal? More silence. Diaz flipped his own notepad open. Because unauthorized removal of private property without legal cause is considered attempted theft under city ordinance. Their faces drained of color. And I wasn't done yet. I turned to the neighbors. Out of curiosity, does anyone here remember a vote authorizing the HOA to tow cars from private property? Mrs. Feldman shook her head. Nope. And I checked the bylaws last night. Not official. Another neighbor chimed in. Diaz nodded, scribbling in his notepad. Attempted unauthorized removal of private property. No court order. No board approval. He looked up. You boys want to keep digging this hole? I swear, if I'd had a camera right then, I could have sold that footage to the History Channel as a documentary on the moment everything went wrong. And then, like clockwork, we heard her. What's going on here? Came the shrill voice of Marlene, president of the Oak Ridge HOA. She marched down the sidewalk like Napoleon returning from exile. Hair frazzled, clipboard clenched, cheeks red. She barreled into the scene without realizing she was walking into a buzzsaw. Why is there a police car here? She demanded. I smiled. Good morning, Marlene. She narrowed her eyes. What did you do? Oh, not much, I said. Just called the police when 2 of your guys tried to steal my car. Steal? Marlene laughed. That's standard HOA procedure. Diaz raised an eyebrow. So you authorized this? Marlene hesitated. Well, the HOA has authority over the community. Diaz shook his head. You don't have authority to tow cars from private property without due process. Silence. Marlene flipped open her clipboard. Section 12, paragraph 8. Do you have proof this vehicle hasn't moved in 48 hours? I asked. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Tried again. Nothing. Do you know whose car this is? I pressed. She scowled. Yours, obviously. And do you know who I am? That was the moment Marlene realized she'd made a catastrophic error. The gears in her head seized up. She blinked rapidly. Diaz stepped in. He's the chief of police. Marlene's face turned gray. And what you authorized, Diaz continued, could be considered abuse of power. I think we can handle this reasonably, she stammered. I smiled. Sure. Cancel the fine. Send an email to all residents explaining your mistake. Her jaw clenched. Fine, she ground out. The neighbors cheered. Marlene ordered Tim and Roy to unhook my car immediately. They scrambled to obey. But Marlene wasn't done with me yet.